Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Casey Braun, and I'm the curator at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's Yadgar Family Lecture, which will be presented by Dr. Sarah Graff, curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sarah's visit today is made possible with generous support from the Yadgar Family Endowment Fund, which was established to advance the care, interpretation, and generation of new scholarship around the Assyrian reliefs at the BCMA. These extraordinary works of art have been a highlight of the college's collection since arriving in 1860. Their prominence has been heightened since the renovated museum opened to the public in 2007, when the reliefs were put on long-term view in a light-filled gallery that welcomes all visitors to the second floor. Also visible to the wider public through the glass facade of these buildings, these works have become one of the most iconic and visible pieces at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. In 2015, attacks by ISIS on Ashurnasirpal II's Northwest Palace, the archaeological site from which the reliefs were excavated, reduced the ancient city to rubble, a horrific fate for this area of vital historic and cultural significance. Given these recent events, the BCMA's reliefs raise critical questions, not only about ancient Assyrian art and culture, but also about the immense responsibilities that come with collecting and stewarding objects from the ancient past, especially those with complex connections to modern notions of cultural heritage and identity. Here at Bowdoin, we are so fortunate to have support from the Yadgar Family Endowment to critically explore the ever-changing patterns in how the Assyrian reliefs are researched and interpreted. To this end, we are thrilled to welcome Sarah Graff to campus to speak about how she has been navigating these complexities in her own curatorial work. In fact, Sarah has visited Bowdoin in the past, helping to establish the Northwest by Northeast initiative with Sean Burris, the former Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow and interim curator at the BCMA. The goal of Northwest by Northeast is to explore the Assyrian reliefs from the Northwest Palace that are now in collections throughout the northeastern United States, including Bowdoin and the Met. Sarah joined the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2007, after serving as the Hagop Kevorkian Curatorial Fellow from 2006 to 2007. She earned her PhD from New York University's Institute of Fine Art in 2012. Much of her research has focused on ancient demons, monsters, and magic, including the Mesopotamian demon Humbaba. She has also pursued research on the practical, cultural, and symbolic dimensions of clay in ancient Mesopotamia. She's taught at Cooper Union and at the CUNY Graduate Center, and has taken part in archaeological excavations in Syria at Tel Mozan, also known as the ancient site of Urkesh. In her role at the Met, Sarah has worked on a number of curatorial projects, including the 2014 exhibition Assyria to Iberia at the Dawn of the Classical Age and its accompanying catalog. More recently, she has been closely involved in the reinstallation of the Met's Assyrian galleries. This afternoon, she will share insights from that process, informing us not only about the Met's own collection of Assyrian reliefs from the Northwest Palace, but also about how she and her colleagues are rethinking the ways that cultural heritage is displayed in cultural institutions. Sarah will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. We are recording this afternoon's talk, and for the sake of the recording, we're going to invite you to use one of the two microphones positioned here towards the front of the room so that the recording can pick up your questions. But without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to this year's Yadgar Family Lecture speaker, Sarah Graff.
Thank you so much, Casey. And before I begin, I just want to say thank you to everybody at the museum for such a warm welcome, to Amanda Skinner for arranging so much of today, to Frank and Ann Goodyear for being good colleagues to me going back years, and of course to the Yadgar family for their commitment and their understanding that Assyrian reliefs need long-term support in order to be, to continue to be both appreciated, conserved, and understood in terms of the facets that they contain, which I hope we're gonna start to unpack a little bit today. So today I'll present the Met's Assyrian Relief Court, and as I said, I'll attempt to peel back a few of those many layers contained in this complex and iconic space. The Met's Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art is undergoing a renovation of the permanent galleries, and as part of the work of rethinking the entire presentation of the collection, we're also considering how to reframe the Assyrian court. I'll try to demonstrate in the next hour or so why this is such a complicated task, and to share some ideas for how to give visitors different interpretations of a space that is both incredibly rich and stubbornly inflexible in its arrangement. Underlying my talk is the complicated question of what actually is curatorial work. What does a curator do? The popular image of the curator is someone who arranges objects in a gallery and writes the explanatory labels. And this is certainly part of the job, but in the case of the Met's Assyrian court, we won't actually be moving the reliefs from their current configuration over the course of the renovation. So what does our work entail, if not that? And I hope after the next hour that I will have given you some idea of how to answer this question. So I just wanted to show a map of the second floor of the Met, where, actually, I should have asked if there's a pointer up here.
Let me go check with Nick.
Okay. All right, well, this will challenge me in terms of explaining things, visual things with words. But if you look at the lower left corner of the screen, you see there's a kind of square configuration of galleries, and then directly next to it says Ancient Near Eastern Art. So that run of 4 galleries along the bottom of the screen feeds into the Assyrian Relief Court, which you see the drawings of the 2 colossal guardian figures. And then you have another gallery up above, and then one as you continue going around that way. And you see that Greek and Roman art is directly adjoining our galleries. So the renovation is actually a collaboration with the Department of Greek and Roman Art, whose Cypriot collection is installed adjacent to the ancient Near East galleries. I won't have time to get into the collaborative aspects of the renovation today, but you'll see some views of the Cypriot galleries in what I show of the plans for the renovation. And so just to signal that that's going to be part of what you see today. And before getting deeper into the talk, I also want to say a thing or two about names, since they're an important part of how we frame information and communicate it to a wide audience. Within the department, we've had a long-running conversation for several years about changing the name of both the department and the galleries. It's currently called Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, but I'm showing you a few of the websites for collections in this area that have recently changed their names. So the Morgan Library and Museums collection was recently changed to Ancient Western Asian Seals and Tablets. The University of Chicago's Oriental Institute very recently, as of last week, changed their name to the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. And then the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East is actually a new name for the Harvard Semitic Museum. So they kind of went through the process and came up with the name that we have now, which is Ancient Near East. So I hope that that demonstrates that it's not an easy choice to make. And it's really hard to explain what this field encompasses to the average Met visitor who's likely to be a bit confused by ancient Near East, ancient Middle East, ancient West Asia, not to mention other options like Mesopotamia, ancient Iran. Unfortunately, all the naming options present significant challenges. Still, it's important to be mindful of the names that we use in presenting this collection, especially since many of them have colonial legacies that distance them from the region and its people today. So the renovation of the permanent galleries requires a complete rethinking of how we present the collection. The previous installation dates largely to 1984, although some galleries were reinstalled in 1999. And as you can see in these gallery views, the emphasis was on presenting an orderly march through the regions and time periods covered in standard art history textbooks. So you see maps and extensive wall texts that were intended to perform an educational function for visitors that were seeking authoritative historical narratives. As a result, there were some challenging moments where the textbook and the collection didn't quite match up. So there a time period or a place that played a key role, thank you so much, in the standard art history narrative proved impossible to evoke in the galleries because the collection doesn't have any objects that connect to it, or the objects in the collection from that period end up being sort of not the dazzling highlights that you would expect to encounter for the way that that period is presented in the textbooks. Even the Assyrian reliefs, which are visitor favorites, don't quite fit into the textbook narrative themselves. So the reliefs in the Assyrian Sculpture Court come from two buildings, the Ninurta Temple and the Northwest Palace of Ashurnasirpal II, even though they now appear as a single room. They don't form a coherent narrative, as do, here, in this extremely confusing diagram, you can see that all of the reliefs are labeled with their place of origin. These two small reliefs that are sort of next to the Lamassu, next to the colossal guardian figures, those are the ones that come from the Ninurta Temple, but the rest of them come from the Northwest Palace. And as you can, I hope, see, they come from room I, room S, all of these different rooms in the palace. So these would not have been installed together, with the one exception being these two slabs that do actually meet up. So, but they don't form a coherent narrative. And this is in contrast to the reliefs from the throne room, room B, which are shown here in the British Museum. And you can see these are the room B reliefs on this side, and they join up exactly. They make this very nice, neat narrative. And actually on the other side are reliefs from a different room in the Northwest Palace that also join up. They're also from the same original context. So the Met's sculptures from the Northwest Palace are from 6 different rooms within the palace and are, as I said, joined together in a sequence that they never would have been in antiquity. And then the reliefs from later kings, which include probably what most people think of when they think of Assyrian sculpture, the famous battle scenes and animal hunts from the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurnasirpal at Nineveh, are scarce in the Met's collection. The Met does have small pieces of larger reliefs from the Assyrian palaces at Khorsabad and Nineveh, and here I'm showing you the reliefs from the palaces at Nineveh. But as you can see, they don't join up to form a larger whole, and it can be difficult to fill in their original setting with its grand scale and epic narrative scenes. So even the most textbook part of the Met's collection doesn't quite fit with the textbook narrative. So facing this problem, we decided to start over at the beginning and to take a hard look at what was actually in the collection without applying an external narrative from the start. So what kinds of stories could we tell based on the collections themselves? And I'm going to show you something that looks really scary, but this is kind of our planning document for what to do with all of the objects in our collection. How could we maybe look at some interesting and underappreciated areas where we could tell new stories? So this also entailed reframing our goals and expectations for the galleries on a big picture scale. If the galleries were no longer serving as a textbook whose primary function was educational, what could they do instead? This was a real challenge for the gallery renovation group, and I just want to mention that this is a group of between 8 and 10 members, consisting of curators, collection staff, fellows, researchers, and our department's longtime conservator, which has been meeting for years, regularly twice a week, on an intensive schedule that allowed us to develop a shared understanding and to experiment with collaborative working methods. So our discussion started with those big questions like, what could the galleries be besides a textbook? And the vision that came out of these regular meetings, and here I'm going to show you some of the architects' renderings that are based on this groundwork that we laid over years of re-envisioning a new presentation of the collection. So this vision, and as I hope these beautiful images communicate, was a desire to share the beauty and excitement we felt when encountering these objects with the visitors, to give them, a window into that world of really excitement and appreciation, to open up visitors' perspectives in the ways that we had also felt our own perspectives expand, to share a particular sense of these ancient cultures that makes the familiar strange, while still grounded in recognizing that ancient people were human just as we are. We came up with a framework we call storytelling through objects, in which we trace important themes through different groupings, sometimes juxtaposing those from different regions or time periods in a more flexible way than the previous installation was able to do. We'll still follow a general progression in time from early to late, but we'll do so with flexibility, recognizing that this rigid structure doesn't suit our collection or our space. For instance, this is just sort of the end where we join up again with Cyprus. So the Assyrian Relief Court is at one end of these two arms of the galleries, and particularly this long arm of the galleries. So you would suggest that it should join up with similarly dated objects in the adjoining galleries, but this doesn't actually work because the period that they belong to falls more in the middle than either end of the objects the collections covered. So in turn, if we did install objects in chronological order, and we started with the Assyrian reliefs, and then we worked backwards in time so that the oldest objects ended up here, then we lose the opportunity to display the latest works in our collection across from the galleries for Islamic art, which immediately predate the rise of Islam. These are objects from the Sasanian period where you can very clearly see the continuity across periods. So it doesn't really work either way that you think about it. So instead of sticking to a rigid chronology, the Assyrian Sculpture Court will stake out a middle ground. In the gallery immediately to the west of the Assyrian Court, which I'm showing you a render of here, sculptures carved at Tal Halaf in northeastern Syria, right here, during the 10th or 9th century BC, will be installed facing the Assyrian sculptures that may have taken them as models or inspiration. In the center of the gallery, a carefully chosen selection of Cypriot works demonstrates the influence of Assyrian style on Cyprus after the incursions of the Assyrian king Sargon II during the late 8th century BC. Adjoining the Assyrian court on the eastern side, a gallery that we're calling Clay and Creation presents ceramic objects ranging from pots and bricks to sculptures and written documents in order to demonstrate the ubiquity of clay in the physical and ideological world of ancient Mesopotamia. Many objects in this gallery date to the Neo-Assyrian period, contemporary with the reliefs in the adjoining sculpture court, but there are also others from the full range of time periods and geographies covered by the collection. In this way, we allow visitors to experience the galleries in a less prescriptive and controlled way, while still leaving ample guideposts for those who choose to follow them. I hope by now that I've convinced you that curatorial work is more than arranging objects and writing labels. A museum is a place with its own, often very inflexible physical reality, as you can see from the example of the awkward positioning of the Assyrian Sculpture Court and its relationship to chronological narratives. We have the benefit of working with physical objects whose charisma and presence is absolutely central to our work. But this means that, again, we go back to a dependence on what happens to be in the collection, which is usually a very idiosyncratically formed group of objects. And we have to be judicious in our use of explanatory texts, since there's a limit to how much text can fit on a label or panel, not to mention a limit to what visitors can take in during their time in the museum. And based on this, I've come to understand museum work along a tripartite model in which the space, the collection, and the people are in dynamic relation to each other. By people, I mean not only visitors and staff, but also the entire long history of individuals who made, used, traded, excavated, altered, and otherwise interacted with the objects that now occupy this space, not to mention the future generations who will have their own relationships with these things and interpretations that we can't anticipate or even imagine. So I envision my work as something close to staging a play or performance in which multiple elements combine to produce encounters that are hopefully memorable and resonant, but in the end are ephemeral. At this point, I'd like to turn to the Assyrian reliefs directly and to their place in the museum. And I'm showing you not the relief court as it appears now, but the render that we have come up with together with the architects for how they would be reframed in the renovated galleries. And we'll come back and we'll look at this several more times. I'll take you through several layers of information about the reliefs, starting with their original context and continuing to stay with them as they move from Ottoman Iraq to the UK and finally to New York. All of this contextual information is important, and all of it should be made accessible to interested visitors to the Assyrian court at the Met, but as you'll see, it would be a serious challenge to condense this information into a standard gallery text. This is part of the challenge for those of us working to reframe the Assyrian court. As you probably noticed, in the current installation, there are almost no labels or explanatory text. In the renovated galleries, we're considering adding extensive labels along an angled label rail that will run around the entire gallery, which is what you see here. This would allow us to share more information, but it also comes at the cost of interrupting visitors' experience of being immersed in the world of the Assyrian relief. So it's another give and take that we have to weigh. So as I mentioned, the reliefs in the Met's Assyrian Sculpture Court come from two royal buildings of King Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled Assyria between 883 and 859 BC. He initiated the construction of a new palace and other buildings at the site of Nimrud, near present-day Mosul, early in his reign. Because of its position on the mound, excavators referred to Ashurnasirpal's palace as the Northwest Palace. You see it down here, very nicely to the northwest. We know from a carved stone stele set up inside the Northwest Palace, just outside the entrance to the throne room, right there, this is the throne room, that when its construction was partially completed in 879 BC, the king hosted a 10-day celebration for nearly 70,000 guests, including both Assyrians and foreign dignitaries. And the text on the stele lists the luxurious menu and describes how the guests were bathed, anointed with oil, and sent home, quote, in peace and joy. In the Northwest Palace, for the first time in the history of Assyria, we see monumental stone slabs carved in low relief used as wall decoration, a type of sculpture that would come to define Assyrian art in the modern imagination. The stone slabs depict the king and his court, scenes of battle and conquest, and lion and bull hunt scenes. By far the most common image on the reliefs is that of a stylized tree, which you can see here, which is usually called a sacred tree by modern scholars, although we don't actually know what it represents. The tree is approached by winged figures, either human or eagle-headed, who hold buckets and cone-shaped objects. They're sometimes joined by the king, and sometimes they hold other types of offerings, such as pomegranates. Their benevolent, protective character is clear, although we don't really know what they're doing. Probably this ritual was well known to the Assyrians and would have been instantly recognizable to those who lived in or visited the palace. It's not described in any of the many texts written during the late Assyrian period, nor is it mentioned in the band of text you see running through the middle of the wall, which gives a description of the king's lineage and describes the construction of the palace. This text repeats with some variations across each stone slab, starting again at the upper left corner, and sometimes cutting off early if there isn't enough space. So each of these slabs, this rectangle here, is the same text, here and here and on all of the slabs in the palace. Because it's so standardized, it's generally referred to now as the standard inscription. It was both a record of Ashurnasirpal's accomplishments and a visual device that unifies adjoining slabs. The inscription occupies the same horizontal band on all reliefs in a given room. This effect is mostly lost in the Met Sculpture Court since the reliefs come from 6 different rooms, although you can still see how the inscribed areas of these 2 slabs from the same room join up very neatly right there. Even though many of the Assyrian kings following Ashurnasirpal built their own new palaces, first at Khorsabad and then at Nineveh, the Northwest Palace continued to be used for various purposes. For instance, under the domestic wing was a series of vaulted tombs in which the queens of the Assyrian court were buried. The excavation of the tombs by Iraq's State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, starting in 1988, revealed spectacular golden jewelry and other objects, none of which have been seen outside of Iraq. And really, they are extraordinary, and they are hardly known because of that. The time when they were excavated, it was right before the First Gulf War. They've mostly been in the bank vault in Baghdad, but they are some unbelievable, incredibly beautiful, and just mind-boggling kind of, like on the same level as, King Tut's tomb, but almost nobody knows about them outside of this very narrow circle. The palace and other royal buildings were also used as storage magazines for massive amounts of booty and tribute. Ivory furniture and other precious objects, which originated in the kingdoms of Syria and in the cities of the Phoenicians along the Mediterranean coast, were kept by the thousands in Nimrud's storerooms. Many of these precious fragments are in the Met's collection, so I'm just showing a few of these. This is probably the face of a cult statue. It's one of the 2 largest ivories known from the ancient Middle East, and it's probably a goddess. And there were tens of thousands of these ivory fragments in the collection stored by the Assyrian kings at Nimrud. For nearly 300 years, Assyria maintained its military supremacy over all of Western Asia. But in 614 BC, and then again 2 years later, a coalition of Babylonian and Iranian armies attacked and defeated the Assyrian forces, sacking and destroying the palaces, which were not reoccupied by the Babylonian kings who came after them. Gradually over time, the palaces were abandoned. It's likely that local people still remembered and passed on knowledge about these sites, which were visible as mounds in the landscape, but unfortunately their words are rarely recorded in early modern histories of the region. Instead, the standard narrative is one of the European discovery of lost civilizations, and this is where we pick up the next chapter in the story. In the 1840s, French and English explorations into Ottoman lands were increasingly focused on finding and extracting antiquities. In 1843, a French expedition uncovered monumental Assyrian sculptures from what was later identified as the palace of King Sargon II at Khorsabad. And these are all in the area around present-day Mosul. 2 years later, a young Englishman, Henry Austin, or Austin Henry, Layard, first dug for antiquities in the Mound of Nimrud. Layard was acting on his own, not as a government employee, but the British ambassador to the Ottomans, Stratford Canning, provided him with encouragement in the form of both financial and diplomatic support. It seems that Canning was motivated largely by a desire to compete with France. Through Canning's advocacy, Layard received authorization for his dig from the Ottoman government, which allowed him to remove the sculptures and ship them to London. Layard and the workers he employed dug up many of the reliefs now at the Met, including the 2 lamassu, or monumental guardian figures. And you'll notice that, so these are the Mets, and you notice if you look especially at the feet that they're not a pair, actually. So this one's a lion, and this one's a bull. And in the British Museum are these 2. So I think you can tell just from the juxtaposition that this is a pair and this is a pair. So These two arrived in London directly from Nimrud, but the pair at the Met got to New York along a much more circuitous route. Layard had many sculptures removed from the mound and shipped to London, which were developments followed with great interest in the press, as we can see in this famous drawing from the Illustrated London News of 1852, showing a Lamassu being dragged up the steps of the British Museum. The trustees of the museum provided financial support for Layard's explorations, but never quite at the level he requested. And this mismatch was a constant source of conflict up until 1851, when Layard left Ottoman Iraq for the last time. To make up the shortfall and to support his efforts to publish his finds for a wide readership, Layard turned to his wealthy cousin, Lady Charlotte Guest, who encouraged his work in a variety of ways for a long period of time. It's a complicated story that's beyond what I can cover today, and it's also been comprehensively retold in John Russell's 1997 book, From Nineveh to New York. In gratitude for her support, Layard sent Lady Charlotte a number of reliefs and the two Lamassu, the mates of the two at the British Museum, which she installed at Canford Manor, her country house in Dorset, England. Here you see a window in the special room constructed at Canford Manor for the Assyrian sculptures, which Lady Charlotte referred to as the Nineveh Porch. Layard believed he had uncovered the Assyrian capital city of Nineveh, which was well known from its appearances in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and published books about his explorations titled Nineveh and Its Remains and the Monuments of Nineveh. Hence the name Nineveh Porch, although the sculptures here we now know come from Nimrud. So 2 generations later, ownership of Canford Manor passed to Lady Charlotte's grandson, Ivor Churchill Guest, who had moved to a different residence and no longer wanted to maintain the house. He sold Canford, which became a school, and the Nineveh Porch became the school's snack bar, or tuck shop in local slang. So, and it still had all this fancy stuff in it. The larger Nineveh Porch sculptures were removed, replaced in the walls of the tuck shop with plaster casts of the originals, and the sculptures, not the casts, were sold to the art dealer Dikran Kalikian in 1919. 7 small reliefs remained in place in the former Nineveh Porch for another 4 decades until they were eventually sold at auction in 1959, ending up in 4 different museums. It was only in 1992 that John Russell discovered that one original stone relief was still in place in the Nineveh Porch, only now covered in whitewash and indistinguishable from the plaster casts. It had been properly identified as an original sculpture in an inventory made by Assyriologist L.W. King in the early 20th century, but was somehow missed twice during both the 1919 sale and the 1959 auction. The relief was removed from the wall and sold at auction in 1994 to the art dealer Noriyoshi Horiuchi, and is now in the collection of the Miho Museum near Kyoto. So, and just a side note, this is a consistent thing that you find anytime you read about reliefs from the Northwest Palace, that they have been dispersed more than any other Assyrian palace decoration. They are found in many, many different countries and collections all over the world, which is not the case with sculptures from Nineveh, sculptures from Khorsabad, and it really is something that is distinctive about the Northwest Palace, that not only their original lifespan in the palace, but their afterlife and their dispersal is a big part of the story of these objects as well. Now let's return to the sale of the first group of sculptures in 1919. Kalikian attempted for years with little success to sell the reliefs he had purchased, a process exhaustively detailed in John Russell's book. So if you want to read about that, I highly recommend it. By 1927, the collection had finally been sold to John D. Rockefeller, and after extensive negotiations with the Penn Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures in Chicago, and with the Met, Rockefeller decided that they should join the collection of the Met. The Met's collection already contained several Assyrian reliefs, including one which was donated in 1884, but the sculptures from Canford formed the largest single group in the museum. And just as a side note, That 1884 sculpture, the first one to enter the Met's collection, has a direct connection with the Bowdoin reliefs because it was a gift from the sister and brother-in-law of Henry Byron Haskell, who gave the 5 reliefs that form the Bowdoin collection in 1860. So all of these are very small little networks. So it was in 1933 that the newly acquired Assyrian sculptures were finally installed in the museum, with the lion and bull forming a gateway into the classical galleries, thus embodying the prevailing narrative of the time, in which Assyrian and other non-European ancient art was seen as an earlier link in the developmental chain leading up to the great artistic accomplishments of Greece and Rome. The sculptures were eventually moved to the north end of the building for a new installation that opened in 1960, only for that installation to be dismantled 7 years later as a result of construction in this wing that would eventually house the Temple of Dendor. So this is the 1960s installation. After this, they remained off view for 14 years. The present gallery was finally opened in 1981 on the second floor, where the galleries for the art of the ancient Near East are now located. And for now, there's no intention to move them again. And you can see this is pretty much the way that they look now, except this ceiling has been taken away and the original skylights illuminate the space now. But just as we would never present them today as an early step on the road to classical art, we need to keep in mind that their future interpretation and display will function within paradigms that we can't see from our present moment. Their itinerary up until now has been varied and responsive to both large-scale social forces, such as European colonization of West Asia, followed by the concentration of wealth in the hands of American capitalists, and at the same time, idiosyncratic personal decisions, such as Layard's fascination with the region around Mosul and the Guest family's decision to sell their country estate. It would be foolish to try and predict what the next decades will bring for these 3,000-year-old sculptures, which have already persisted across an unimaginable timescale. Speaking for myself, I've come to understand the Assyrian sculptures and the art in this collection more generally as an indivisible aspect of human identity. Art and people need each other and exist in mutual interdependence. I would even say that the objects themselves need to be kept alive through regular and sustained engagement. I'm sure this curatorial approach would not have made sense in London and New York 100 years ago, but in this present moment, when so much of the narrative around Assyrian art is focused on loss and destruction, I found it a very important frame for how to present and interpret the collection. One way for this frame to manifest is through highlighting the connection between the present-day Assyrian community and the sculptures, a connection that has been minimized in scholarship up until very recently. It's a complex relationship that I've been lucky to learn about from many community members, including Professor Sargon Donabed, Ruth Kambar, and other colleagues from the Assyrian Studies Association, as well as the Iraqi Assyrian artist and activist Ninos Tabet. As a curator, my role is to welcome community members in, to take my cues from them, and work to open up the museum as much as possible, and to continue to take part in an ongoing public dialogue. I don't aspire to definitive statements about who owns heritage, a question that, to me, seems to be fruitless from the start because, as everyone who raises this question knows, it's both antagonistic and impossible to answer. It's far more productive to open up avenues for discussion and to be appreciative of the multiplicity of perspectives on topics like cultural inheritance and the endless push-pull between change and continuity. But one thing that curatorial work gains from integrating the voices of modern Assyrians is a true demonstration that the lifespan of the objects is in fact ongoing, and our present moment is by no means the end point and final word. Another way that I'm especially interested in activating the Sculpture Court is as a space for performance that draws from the collection. Several years ago, the Met's Live Arts Department commissioned a dance and music performance from Silas Farley, a choreographer and dancer at the New York City Ballet, in collaboration with Ear Hustle, a podcast which shares perspectives from incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people. Titled Songs from the Spirit, the The performance took place in March 2019 across multiple locations and started in the Assyrian Sculpture Court. It was a revelation to see the dancers in this space and to experience the combination of song and movement as an enlivening force. And it's not the same, but I want to show you a short clip from that performance.
I saw my brother, he did me wrong. Had a gun up to my face, my money's gone. I said, please don't be that way. I'm just trying to make it through the day. Love is crying, love is dying, love is crying, love. I saw my sister, she did me wrong. I had a smile upon my face, but hers was so cold. I said, sister, please don't go. I'm just trying to say hello. She said, you better not come around me before too long. Love is crying, love is dying, love is crying, love. Love is crying, love is dying, love is crying, love. Can't you hear the cries from heaven up above? Looking down upon the world of dying love. Hurry up and don't delay. Before your chance to save the world is going away.
Okay. But dance and music aren't the only possibilities for performance in the Assyrian Sculpture Court. Through an ongoing partnership with the organization Narratio, which helps refugee youth develop tools to tell their own stories on their own terms, we've now held 2 poetry recitals in the court. The space really comes alive when it's used for active performance. I'm sorry for the shifting back and forth, but I want to show you another video. All right. So, on a fundamental level, the use of this iconic gallery space as a stage for thoughtfully chosen performances is much more radical than it seems. It naturalizes ways of being in and relating to the space that are different from the quiet visual observation that is the standard mode through which most visitors are conditioned to encounter it. When they were installed in Ashurnasirpal's palace, were these sculptures respectfully contemplated? Were they largely ignored? What physical practices could palace residents or visitors have carried out as a way to honor or acknowledge, or even in certain moments to profane or insult them? We have no idea what these past modes of interaction were, nor can we realistically expect that our current social norms would be paralleled widely across time and space. I'm inspired by thinking through performance towards other ways that the sculptures could be engaged by visitors, ways that we curators haven't imagined. So far, we've seen the vast amount of information on the context of the Met's Assyrian reliefs, and then some ways in which the space can be brought to life in specific moments. In this last section, I'll share 2 more ways to reframe the Assyrian Sculpture Court. And I'm going to move through this a little faster because I think we're running a little bit behind. So the first frame entails mounting a temporary special exhibition in this space within the permanent galleries. And temporary and permanent exhibitions are usually considered 2 completely different, if not diametrically opposed, models of curating, which is maybe a talk for another day. But in short, temporary exhibitions are a lot more flexible because you choose which objects go in a space which is purpose-built for that exhibition. Whereas with the permanent exhibition, the permanent galleries, you have one collection and one basically orientation for those objects. But in this case, they were combined for the exhibition Rayon Tabet, Alien Property. This exhibition was co-curated by my colleagues Kim Benzel, curator in charge of my department, and Claire Davies, associate curator in modern and contemporary art at the Met. In October 2019, Alien Property was installed in the space of the Assyrian Sculpture Court and the 2 galleries adjoining it on either side. The exhibition explored personal narratives, institutional histories, themes of loss, destruction, and repair, and the silences and misdirections of archives. And unfortunately, I can't talk about it in any kind of depth today, but it was a really wonderful exhibition. But I just want to mention the electrifying effect that it had of installing the massive sculpture you see here as part of the exhibition in the center of the Assyrian court. The sculpture is a seated figure from Tel Halaf in northeastern Syria, carved during the 10th or 9th century BC. And it has its own very long and complex story of movement, destruction, repair. But what I want to point out is that Kim and Claire chose to orient it facing the Lamassu, which I think normally we would turn it around so that all 3 are kind of looking at you together, so you get this sense of grandeur and kind of a mighty, impassive facade. So just this simple decision to reverse the orientation has kind of a jarring effect, and the 3 sculptures are now encountering each other on an almost equal footing, although everything about them is different. They're carved from different stones, they're in different styles, the seated sculpture is older. It comes from a part of the world that probably influenced the creation of the Assyrian palace reliefs. Although this question of sources and influences is very complex, and you can't draw a straight line, so in fact, by turning the sculpture to face the other 2, you make this ambiguity sensible, even if that's even just on a subconscious level. It's no longer a direct linear progression like the Lamassu in 1933 that led from the main entrance into the Greek sculpture gallery. So I feel that these choices that the curators made created a series of reverberations within the space that are really productive and interesting. And after Alien Property, it's clear that the sculpture court should be considered as a space for future temporary installations, because it's not just a space, but it can actively participate in that installation. And the final frame I'd like to propose entails using projected light and color to highlight specific areas of the reliefs. And this may not be new to a lot of you who followed the work that was done in recent years at this very museum. It's long been known that the Assyrian reliefs were painted, at least in part, and some reliefs that are still in place at the palace in Nimrud which haven't been subject to intense cleaning, still have black beards and hair, as well as white eyeballs and black pupils, like the wonderful relief of Ashurnasirpal here at the BCMA, which still has, you can see that really vivid white and black eye. Just showing some of the news stories about the work to project restored color on the reliefs at the BCMA. Layard's drawings and watercolors also preserve a great deal of color, which you can see in this image. This is a watercolor, a very famous watercolor by Layard, reconstructing the throne room of the palace. And some of that's definitely exaggerated or invented, but it's worth taking seriously the extent of the added color, because Layard was witness to the uncovering of the reliefs after thousands of years of burial, and he recorded seeing traces of fragile pigment that are no longer evident, whether they vanished through exposure to the elements, through overcleaning, or were pulled off the surface in the process of creating molds for plaster casts. Scholars in recent years have increasingly confronted the artificial whiteness of ancient sculpture and the ways in which this image of gleaming colorless surfaces was and is bound up in racist notions of the past. The loss of color in the current image of ancient sculpture isn't confined to one area of antiquity, and the topic is complex, involving both the limitations of what traces of pigment can be scientifically observed, as well as how to convey to visitors how the sculptures might have looked when first created. Just within the Met itself, during the past decade, there have been several different approaches to bringing color back to ancient sculpture, and I'll talk briefly about these. This is another color reconstruction. This project is called Learning Sites, and you can see how kind of garish it is. But all of this it's very hard to both document what the traces of paint are on the sculptures, and then also to kind of try and make that look anywhere close to what it looked like. So color projection is something that a lot of museums are going with because it's less definitive. And this is a project that the Department of Egyptian Art at the Met has been undertaking since 2015. So they project this colorful overlay onto the side wall of the Temple of Dendur. The colors were selected by a fellow in their department named Erin Peters, whose research specialization is in the topic of ancient color on Egyptian temples. And she worked closely with the museum's digital department to create different ways to access the restored view. They tried an augmented reality viewer, and ultimately they chose to install a small projector in the gallery, which cycles through 4 slightly different reconstructions of a scene showing the Roman Emperor Augustus as pharaoh offering wine to the deities Hathor and Horus. And this is a really low profile intervention into a monumental space in which visitors have many different options for vantage points and approaches. You can see kind of, it's in the background. You don't have to have your experience be defined by it. So I think it's a friendly, inobtrusive glimpse at a vanished aspect of the temple's original appearance. Meanwhile, the Met's Department of Greek and Roman Art has also begun to address the mismatch between the present appearance of sculptures in their collection and their original vivid coloration. So this is a view of an exhibition that recently closed titled Chroma, in which painted and gilded casts created by researchers Vincenz Brinkmann and Ulla Koch-Brinkmann were interposed among the stone and bronze sculptures in the permanent galleries for Greek and Roman art. So again, another temporary exhibition in the permanent gallery space. And here you see the painted cast for the Sphinx. It's also the banner image for the show that comes from the top of this grave marker in the Met's collection. And it's kind of funny, there are 3 Sphinxes in this gallery because this is actually a cast. This is the original sculpture, which is too fragile to be out in the air and is kept in a case. So it's kind of a funny, mise en abîme, like sort of Hall of Mirrors effect of Sphinx upon Sphinx upon Sphinx, which I don't know if they intended that, but I kind of like it. Within the Met's Assyrian Sculpture Court, there's one relief that still retains traces of its original paint, which is on the sandals of this figure here. But unfortunately, beyond what we can see with the naked eye here, investigations by scientists and conservators at the Met have failed to locate other traces of original color, maybe because they were overcleaned in the 19th century. And this is a shame because other reliefs that have been investigated, such as some in the collection at Yale that my colleague Shianti Thavapalan, who you see in the little inset video there, has investigated, have many traces of pigment. And you're seeing here Shianti's speculative reconstruction of one of the reliefs from Yale, which I like a lot because it looks more like paint. It doesn't have that flatness of a lot of the color reconstructions. And one of the really interesting things that she and other researchers have found is that the inscription seems to have been inlaid with a bright, vivid blue pigment called Egyptian blue. That's about the color here. So imagine this kind of glowing inscription. And because we can't find traces of color at the Met's reliefs, we would have to be really clear about the degree to which it's speculative. So in this render, we're showing some projected color on the reliefs, but we would have to make this a very dynamic projection to show that it's not definitive, and to not give visitors this false sense of certainty. Another option would be to show both the areas of reconstructed color and a focused illumination on areas of detail that you can't really see it as the gallery is now, and that if you get close enough to see these tiny incised details, the guards get really alarmed, and as they should, but you can't really see them as it is. So it's possible that in addition to reconstructing some areas of color, we could also we could use focused illumination on some very fine areas of incision on the reliefs, so drawing people's attention to areas that they can't really see as the sculptures are installed and lit now. And I just want to say as a disclaimer that I'm mindful that in the 3 years before our galleries open, there are likely to be significant developments in the areas of digital technologies that may offer other possibilities. We have no idea what the technology is going to be like in 3 years, so I just put a big asterisk on that. But it's worth considering how we would want, in an ideal world, to signal to visitors that the monochromatic gray sculptures they see are not what the people who lived in the palace or visited it would have seen. But I hope in this talk today I have made my case that there's no authentic moment that can serve as the guide for how to present the reliefs today, and that in fact it was a different palace for different groups of people at different times. So ultimately it comes back to us, and we have to make our own decisions for how to interpret and present them, rather than try to erase the fingerprints of the curatorial process. Thank you for your attention, and I think I'm still under 5:30, so I'm going to stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if anyone would like, we just ask that you come up and please use the microphone.
Hi, I was wondering if there's ever been any sort of consideration to display the reliefs separately, given that they were never, intended to be seen like all together in this way, and your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, they have been in the past. I didn't have a lot of time to go into all of the different installations today. In the 30s, they were kind of scattered throughout after the Greek sculpture galleries. So you would go in through the Lamassu, see the Greek sculptures, and then there was another gallery, and there were a few reliefs not unified in a space. I mean, those are limited because, like, when I try and visualize your question, I see that, and of course that has the limitations of being like an old black and white photo from before my parents were born that isn't really so easy to visualize. But I do think that they would look diminished, is the problem. That when you have something that's cut out from, really it's a problem of the museum. The museum is meant to have framed works of art hung on the walls and some sculptures that maybe you can walk around. And I think that this is never going to be a frame that works so well for the Assyrian sculptures, because they work best as a coherent whole, and that's not something that can exist anymore. So I think the question is like, what do you negotiate as the middle ground between the structural constraints of what the museum allows you to do and what you can never get back to, which is the reliefs in place in the palace. And, but I don't know. I mean, maybe in that case, I would say you would pick one and maybe highlight it and display it on its own, and then have that kind of focused contemplation experience. But that, to me, would be kind of forcing the sculptures into a frame that works more in the museum, but that maybe isn't as kind to them, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Sarah, thank you for, would you like to go first? Okay. Sarah, thank you for an excellent talk. And this question actually may build on the one that we just had. One of the things I loved about your talk was the way in which you described sort of narrative constructs that adhere to these reliefs and have adhered at different moments over time. You also made reference to the British archaeological excavation in the 19th century that was perhaps in competition with the French archaeological excavation that was happening simultaneously. And then you mentioned a little bit about the movement of these objects to the United States. So I was just curious whether in your experience, looking at installations at the Louvre, the British Museum, and the Met, whether you think there's evidence historically of different national overlays in terms of narrative constructs that may have been applied to either the arrangement of the pieces or even the positioning of these objects within these national art museums, and whether in the present day, especially with what I would anticipate is even further enhanced international collaboration, if any of those constructs are shifting in light of perhaps new international collaborations.
Thank you, Anne.
So
yeah,
thank you.
And thank you. Both of those questions, you're right, they do build together because they're both really about the frame, not so much about the works themselves. And I think that's really important because it's the kind of thing, that question that you asked about the national perspective on these different objects that were being taken out of Ottoman Iraq and then installed at the Louvre and the British Museum. Like, you can only see that in retrospect. I don't think they would have seen that at the time, but I think that you can definitely see in retrospect, like, for instance, if you've ever been to the Louvre and you've seen the Khorsabad sculptures, they are like twice the size of these Lamassu. They're huge, and they're installed in this like big light-filled court. And I think you definitely get this sense of like empire and conquest from that they could have installed them, you know, going with the earlier question, they could have installed them in a much quieter way, but they installed them so that they dominate this whole huge space. And all you see is how big they are. And then, you know, when you see reliefs from that same palace in Chicago at what used to be the Oriental Institute Museum, is now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, they look much less imposing because they're in a smaller space. They're not like placed in the middle of an open court. They're in a smaller gallery that's covered. So I do think that there is a narrative that comes across whether or not the people installing it are conscious of it. You know, in London, they're just in these rows. They're in these long, narrow rooms. And a lot of the time, sorry to my dear colleagues at the British Museum, who I really respect and appreciate, it's not their fault. But in a lot of cases, those galleries are closed. because they just don't have the staff to open them, or they're being asked to do a lot with a little, and so they function more as, like, I would say, a storeroom at the British Museum, that the reliefs there are kind of, they're there, but they're not, they're there in their endless lines and rows. They are there as accumulation. They're not really being presented, the way that they are at the Met, because we have the luxury of having very few. The Americans came by and attempted to get on the colonization bandwagon, but at that point, the European powers had already made had taken so much from the Middle East that there wasn't, this is a function of, like, the time period in which the US achieved, like, enough international power to also be a colonizing force, and that was later than the European powers. So you can read that through the museum installations, like a country's self-image of their own power and grandeur that it's reflecting back at itself. You have a much smaller collection at the Met, but it is installed with, like, extreme care for the positioning of each relief. So I think that is a really interesting way to look at it and to try and make the frame more visible.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yes.
I have two questions that are more general in their aspect. The first is that having gone, as I suspect many people here have, to museums for decades and decades and decades, one thing that has not changed, and you referenced when you were talking about the small descriptive panels that are by paintings and any art objects. This is a real bee in my bonnet, because my eyes are not as good as they used to be.
Yeah.
And I suspect that happens to almost everyone. And my reading glasses make me get too close, and my distance glasses have to be too far away. And plus, it's a bottleneck, because everyone's waiting to read about the individual object. And I'm wondering, since you've talked about all of these advances that happen, particularly, and I'm a fan of what Bowdoin has done in having the screens with the color so you can get some idea. Has there been any thought of reimagining how the descriptions of artworks are put in museums? This is a very generalized question, because what is done now is what has been done for a century, with a little panel with writing that is getting increasingly smaller to some of us. So that's the first question. And the second one, again, I just wonder, having come back not too many months ago from my first visit to, not my first visit to Greece, but my first visit when the museum there at the foot of the Acropolis is in place, with all of its empty spots ready for the Elgin marbles whenever they shall appear. I'm wondering if has been some thought or discussion or fear or combination of all of the above to when, if and when there is stability in Syria, they are going to decide that it is their patrimony and that these artifacts should be returned to them. So two different.
Those are two important, all of the questions today have been very good and important. As far as the labels go, that is a constant struggle, because curators are always trying to fit more information onto the labels. So that means the text gets smaller. It does actually get smaller. But I don't know that it's that helpful, because, as you pointed out, it's a bottleneck. It's hard to actually see. You can't look at the text and the objects together. So I think I can't really give you anything. I wish I could give you a fix for this problem. We are very interested in audio and in audio interventions into the galleries, and doing more podcasts have been a great thing, I think, for people's experiences of being in a space, like just sort of listening to a podcast. So you could listen to a podcast and walk through a space and I did a podcast with my colleague Sargon Donabed for the Met, where we talked about Assyrian identity and the reliefs, and that's the kind of thing that you could listen to it and walk through the galleries and have that experience of not having your visual sense competing with itself. And I think we also approached the gallery renovation as you have to be able to tell that there's a story there visually before you read the label. you can't just expect people to walk up to a case and read the label and then be like, oh, that's what they're trying to say. You have to also work with people to say, like, so they can not just see a case full of pots and be like, what's the story here? You have to try and give people some more visual clues so that even if they have to read the label to really understand what you're trying to tell them, they're at least helped along that path. And as far as repatriation, which I think is a great question to have, I'm not afraid to have the conversation. I think it's really important. You know, it's not so simple. I really wish that it was so simple as to like give something back that has been stolen. I think that that would be really great, but it doesn't do the work of repair and of kind of mitigating hundreds of years of injury. So I think it has to be, I think you were saying today, Casey, it's one possibility, but there have to be many different possibilities, and there has to be an ongoing relationship. And I think that is the link that's really been severed between, you know, people in the US and people in Iraq or people in Syria. Like, I have the privilege of having good colleagues in both of those countries, but most people don't. You know, it's really hard to forge those relationships when you don't really have that many points of contact. And I think that has to be part of a larger social change where, you know, we need to make an effort to bring our colleagues over here and to go over there and to work together. You know, we need to do a lot of that legwork ourselves as museum professionals. I'm saying that, it's really hard. But things like making sure that young scholars from the Middle East can get, you know, fellowship support to come and study at the Met, to come and look at things in the collection, and to make sure that, like, we go over and we make sure we show up for our colleagues in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. I think that's part of, like, what needs to happen, but it's going to be a very long process. And so, you know, it's probably not going to, I don't think that if all of the Assyrian reliefs went back to Iraq tomorrow, that would be a disaster, because they don't have the infrastructure, because they have been destroyed. You know, the country has been destroyed largely by the US, by, you know, 2 wars. And so you don't have the infrastructure to support this, you know, huge responsibility. So that's part of our responsibility too, is to help build people back up to the point where they can kind of prioritize something like caring for cultural heritage over, you know, clean water and power and things like that. But it's just one of those things where if you pull on that string, that whole sweater unravels, you know, and it's like you can't really fix the problem of museum decolonization without decolonizing the whole world, which is good. That's the direction it needs to go in, but it's not separable, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, from the larger problem of decolonization in general and the life's work of that. But thank you.
Building on that very good question, and maybe a final question for this afternoon, can you talk a little bit about the current ongoing conversations that you're having with cultural authorities, scholars, curators in Iraq and in the Middle East, and, you know, what the, you know, nature of those conversations are about and what future partnerships might look like?
Sure.
Small little question.
Yeah, no, it's a lot. It's hard because you're sort of, we're not at the same, we're like at different levels, right? Like I was telling you about this earlier. I have a very close colleague at the University of Babylon, and I met him when he was a fellow in my department at the Met, and we became close friends, and he invited me to give a talk at his college's annual conference in 2019, and I was delighted. And I went to Iraq, and I gave a talk at the conference, and I got to know a few people there. But it's clear that, like, the levels of resources available to people, at least what I've seen myself in Babylon, and probably in many other places, are just not at the same level as even the basic baseline that we can assume in the US. My friend would really like to start a museum at the university, which is maybe something that Bowdoin could advise on, you know, a small university museum. But it is so hard to even think about, you know, well, what building will the university allow him to use? Will they give him any kind of financial help whatsoever? What kinds of like HVAC work would you have to set up in order to, oh no.
Microphone. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion about the issues that you go through in presenting your works. As a follow-up to this prior question about a contentious and a litigious world, do you curators ever worry about losing your works as the host or legacy countries reach out in various ways to retain or recover their works? And I look at the Parthenon friezes in the London Museum and the continual struggle with the Greeks. Implicit in the Taiwanese Chinese struggle is the mainland Chinese would love to get back all that art that was taken away by Chiang Kai-shek. Is this an issue that you can elaborate on, or is this beyond the scope of your discussion?
I mean, I think we kind of talked about that in the previous question in terms of the work of decolonization, which involves a lot more than just moving objects around. But speaking only for myself, I'm not afraid of losing objects because it's not really about, I hope that the talk made it clear, it's not really about like having a treasure house of things in your collection. It's about what you do with it and who you do it for and with and in what space. And honestly, I think there's so much more flexibility than we've had to explore that it's a constraint that should make your work better if you don't have to depend on, well, I can show this thing, but who are you working with? Who are you doing this for? How can you maybe have that same experience without just having to always fall back onto, you know, well, let me show some art that we've kept in our collection for 100 years. Maybe there's other things that you could do that are more interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for these fantastic questions. Please join me in thanking Sarah for being here. And